Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back, everyone, to Civics in a Year. Today, we're talking about how we use the Federalist Papers to help us understand the Constitution. And with us, we have Dr. Paul Carrese. Dr. Carrese, our question today: how do the Federalist Papers still help us today understand the Constitution?
Thank you, Liz. Great to be with you again. Here it is in 2027. We're 240 years after 1787. So I can understand some skepticism. Isn't there just too much that has changed in America, in the world, from the world that Publius knew 240 years ago? So, how relevant can the Federalist Papers be even to understand the Constitution 240 years later? I mean, just take the question of amendments. There are 27 amendments. There's been a civil war related to some of those amendments. Then beyond that, we've had 2 world wars. So I could see the skepticism, but in fact, even accounting for all the change in the world and the change brought about by, let's put aside the first 10 amendments, which of course Publius knew about. Certainly Madison knew about. Madison's proposing the amendments in the House. So let's roll the first 10 into the original constitutional founding that Publius comprehends and understands. But the further 17, there's amendments toward inclusion, greater democracy, abolishing slavery and voting for Black men at any rate, and then women's suffrage and lowering the voting age later in the 20th century, then empowering the federal government. How can Publius help us to understand, these kinds of changes? Well, I don't think I'm just being overly fond of the Federalist and of Publius to say nearly all of these issues are within the 4 corners, within the orbit of the constitutionalism, and I'll call it the political science that's in the Federalist. Take just the structural questions, the issues, federalism and separation of powers. Are we still debating those? Do we still need some original insights about the debates over them and what they might mean? The Federalist case looks good in lots of ways. We certainly have seen from the War of 1812 on to later international wars that we really did need a strong national government. We needed a strong military capability. When we didn't, in the War of 1812, our national capital was invaded and burned, right? And then we learned from that, went on. Have we seen the advantage of having a strong federal government to promote commerce among the states with foreign trading partners? I think generally yes. We've seen the advantage of the very large pluralistic federal republic, obviously famously defended in Federalist 10, but don't forget Federalist 9. I think we've seen the advantage of that. On the other hand, the anti-federalist arguments look pretty serious. There's a lot of foresight precedents there. Has the federal government grown so large that the spirit of self-government in the states and localities, even in civil society, the spirit of self-government has suffered, has dwindled to some extent? Those are real. All of everything I just mentioned. Those are real issues in 2025 in our political debate. I think they should be issues of serious academic, intellectual discussion as well. Let me just go on about federalism. In 2025, under the second Trump administration, aren't there governors in Democratic majority states rediscovering federalism, worried about limits on a president, a very active president, limits on the power of the federal government. Doesn't that happen when a situation is flipped? Democratic president, red states as we call them, Republican controlled states. So that set of issues, separation of powers. I mean, it's in my adult lifetime, I'm nearly 60 years old, but paying attention since the 70s or the 80s to politics, it's always the case that the minority party in Washington, D.C. is talking about separation of powers, how important it is to have separation of powers and checks and balances. And when they're the minority party in the Congress and the House and the Senate, they always want the judiciary to be keeping a close eye on the executive branch, and they always want the administrative agencies to have especially the independent ones like the Fed. We're talking about the Federal Reserve now. In news at the moment, they want them to have independent power. So these are all reasons why the Federalists, the literacy about knowledge of the Federalists, and again I'll use the phrase the political science, the first political science of our country, of the Federalists, is still very relevant. And the independent confirmation of this is that's still the case, that the Federalist is regularly and widely cited in federal appellate court opinions, where they're really getting into constitutional interpretation in the circuit courts, and obviously in the U.S. Supreme Court. It's still seen, the Federalist, as having the best insight on the original public meaning of the Constitution as a whole, particular clauses. And then I'll finally add, right now, in 2025, late 2025, we're clearly in the America 250 commemoration period that officially begins in 2026, 250 years after 1776, and that's gaining some greater national attention and support, seemingly with every passing week. And so there's significant national interest in the Declaration of Independence, in our founding principles, and I'll give this early pitch for the Federalists right now. We tend to forget how often the Federalist invokes the Declaration of Independence, invokes the principles of the Revolution, either explicitly or strongly alluding to the Declaration, the spirit of 1776, the spirit of the Revolution, as guiding its arguments for why we need a stronger federal government, a stronger union, stronger government in the center of the union. They're invoking the Declaration. So that's a great question for us as we begin A250, which again, as we talked about, I hope goes on for decades. As we begin it, what's the connection between Declaration and the Constitution? And the Federalist is there again. The Federalist is a great resource.
So, Dr. Carrese, what are some other dimensions of the Federalist Papers that we tend to overlook now, right? We're almost 240, 230 years later after they were written. So there might be themes or characteristics that we might find valuable in understanding our constitutional form of ordered liberty, how we might use the Constitution better, be a better citizen, or have healthier politics.
I'll mention 4 ideas about this. Having just mentioned, we tend to overlook the presence of the Declaration of Independence in the Federalists, but 4 additional points. One is the Federalists, our first political science, our first account of the larger and more detailed meanings of the Constitution. How much we overlook how much the Federalist talks about the character of a free people. And I'll call it the need for civic virtue. Does use the ideas about civic virtue explicitly, at least at one point, but generally, the need for civic virtue in a self-governing people, the need for a commitment to liberty and to justice, the need for a commitment to the rule of law in a republican form of government, not a democracy, so that the interests and the passions of people are channeled through complex constitutional republican forms so as to better serve the long-term interests of the whole community, the public interest, and to protect minority rights or everybody's individual rights. That can't just be done through having the parchment constitution and institutions. There has to be a spirit, a character in the people to realize the value of these institutional constitutional forms, these principles, to stick with them, channel our energy and our interests and passions through the complex constitutional forms, separation of powers at the federal level, but also federalism between the state local level on the one hand, national federal level. That means, it takes a certain character to have regard for offices that seem very far away. Federal judges seem very far away from us. Who appointed these 9 justices of the Supreme Court, and it takes only 5 to get a majority. Who appointed them? Demigods far away, deciding crucial constitutional questions, maybe overturning laws passed by the Congress and the president. But the Senate, the president as well, they seem like very remote figures in ways. Who gave them all this power? But the Federalists, the political science of the Federalists, makes an argument for this, and then calls for a kind of constitutional character, a Republican civic character in a people. That's, of course, why we're doing what we're doing at the Center for American Civics, and in the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership. This whole system doesn't run of itself. It requires a civic education and civic commitment. So that's one theme. If you want to know where, the opening question in Federalist number 1, can free peoples form governments on the basis of reflection and choice? Or are we destined to live under accident and force, meaning Republican free governments fail? And that this is this might be the most interesting question in all the world. Will the American Federal Republic, will America succeed? Number 37, about the Republican spirit and the Republican character of America and of this proposed Constitution to help improve American politics, American government. Number 55, explicitly, Publius calls out the need for virtue in the citizenry. Yes, we want to rely on these institutional forms, separation of powers, auxiliary precautions, as number 51 says, but we need also virtue in the citizenry. And then, as I've just been alluding to, the references to the high offices later in the Federalists, the defense of the Senate, the defense of the presidency, the defense of federal judiciary, those are places to look. And then the second point. So second point related to it, we overlook the regard for statesmanship, character in the leaders in particular, and especially, I think, the sort of implicit presence of George Washington as the model, never cited by name, but come close to it at one point, saying enlightened statesmen won't always be at the helm. So we need these complicated institutional mechanisms and checks, but wouldn't it be nice if enlightened statesmen were at the helm more often, is the implication there. So again, the defense of the Senate, especially numbers 70 and 72 on the presidency. The Senate, I would look to numbers 62 and 63, including by John Jay. On the executive, the important leadership, statesmanship role there, number 70 and 72. Also, in a way, Federal 78, a kind of judicial statesmanship. Not activism, not political, but statesmanship for the rule of law and for constitutionalism. Now, not so much for the judiciary, but certainly for the ideas of statesmanship in the executive and the Senate. Washington is the implicit model, never explicitly invoked. The closest would be the reference to enlightened statesmanship. Enlightened statesmen will always be at the helm, the model for the presidency in 1772. And I'll mention, it's no accident that George Washington knows about the Federalist and has the essays reprinted in Virginia, makes a private initiative, doesn't want his fingerprints seen on it, but to help the Virginia ratification project. And then I'll mention one other sort of interesting historical note, that you could say in a way, Madison and Hamilton and Jay are all proteges of George Washington. They all knew him, they all worked with him. And in a way, the political science of the Federalist, 85 essays, is written with the model of Washington in mind. And he's the president of the Constitutional Convention. So in a way, the spirit is all throughout. He reprints them, Washington reprints them in Virginia. And then in 1796, in the farewell address, we could do a whole separate episode on this, he pulls Publius back together. After there's been such a strong split between Madison and Hamilton, he has Hamilton in 1796 use Madison's draft from 1792. And then when he likes what Hamilton has done, he eventually asks Hamilton to talk to John Jay about that nearly final draft. And so Washington has pulled together Publius, Madison, Hamilton, Jay, to write the Federal Address. So just a couple of other, quick things that we overlook. A third point, the ambition for American greatness in the Federalist. Again, it begins with number one, maybe the most interesting question in the world. Will this American experiment in self-government succeed? And it's a matter of philanthropy for Americans to think we need to make self-government succeed here so that the model can spread. Number 11, defense of a navy. It's not only to protect us, and Federalist number 11 talks about vindicating the rights of mankind. If we are a strong enough military power to be shaping a more moderate, decent kind of politics out there in the globe. The clear ambition for American greatness that comes across in the essays on the presidency, especially 70, 71, 72. So again, is it an accident? This relates to your opening question. What do we really still learn about the Constitution by studying the Federalist? Well, 230 years later, can we ask, is it an accident that America became the single greatest power in the world on the basis of this political science laid out in the Federalist and the Constitution and the kind of character it calls for the people, the character it calls in statesmanship? It's clear, doing the math, right? It's 160 years from 1787, 1788 to the end of Second World War, 1945, late 1940s, when we're clearly one of the two greatest powers in the world, maybe the greatest then, and we're clearly the sole superpower by 1991. Just a little over 200 years. Is that accidental? Or maybe just Publius explain how we laid the foundation for that and then statesmen built on it. And then final point, and then I think we'll talk about this in a later episode. We overlook the importance of moderation and debate, reasonable civil debate that's right in the Federalist. They quote anti-Federalist authors. They say some snarky things about anti-Federalist authors, but they quote them and they're arguing with them. And in Federalist number 1 and Federalist number 85, Publius Hamilton opens and closes by calling for moderation, for debate, reasonable civil disagreement about this. And I mentioned this in an earlier episode we did on the anti-Federalists. We'll talk about it some more. This great scholar in the 20th century, Herbert Storing, saying, this debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists is indispensable for understanding America. You don't understand the Constitution, you don't understand the founding. The Federalists understand their Constitution they're proposing better because they're going to meet the challenge of the Anti-Federalist arguments, some of which are excellent. And then Storing's larger point that the meaning of the Constitution comes out in the debate. The Federalists learn more about constitutional order. We all do from the debate. So those are all some reasons to appreciate the Federalists. I'll give one last point that, even after the great partisan split, Federalists and Jeffersonians, Hamilton and Jefferson, decades later in 1818, after both Jefferson and Madison have been president, they are leading the design of the University of Virginia and the curriculum of the University of Virginia. What do they place on the required reading list for all students at the University of Virginia in 1818? Including the Declaration, and then the greatness, the magnanimity of George Washington. In 1796, you got his farewell address. They also have the Federalist. Every University of Virginia student got to read the Federalist. Wish that were still the case today. But, even after the partisan split, and, maybe Thomas Jefferson thought more of the essays were written by Madison than he actually understood. 2/3 of them were written by Hamilton. But it's Hamilton writing as Publius, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay. This is the political science of the founding of the Constitution. So Jefferson can join Madison in 1818 saying, this is indispensable. This is the greatest commentary on free government. And that echoes what Washington says in 1788 at the time they're being written. Yeah. This is the greatest commentary on the principles of free government, as well as on our own constitutional order. So, sorry, I got a little excited and went on a bit, but
yep, I love that though. And listeners, we are going to talk in our next episode about the debates and what they can mean for us today. So, Dr. Carrese, thank you so much for your expertise, and I can't wait to talk about the debates after this.
Okay, thanks, Liz.
Thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.